conflict. So this initiative is also become a learning process for ILC member who become a part of this group to find joint strategy in capturing land conflict situations and to have comprehensive and powerful report on how to address land conflict situations. During the pandemic, we call also as anomaly situations or extraordinary situation in regard to the status and the trend of land conflict during the pandemic situations, where economic crises are happening in many Asia's countries, where many business, even big business are collapsed during the pandemic. But our report showing us that there are high and massive land conflict number. So land-based investment is land-based investment are stay fast and brutal, even there are so many violations against human rights. So therefore, we see that the data and the report are beyond database itself, not only a number or statistic, but the report is hoped to be a strong political message, not only to the mass media, to larger public, and become public discourse and main reference to all parties like government to understand the real situation, what is the impact of injustice and what is the impact of land reform is not being implemented, how the impact to the IP's territory not being recognized until now, and how the human rights principles are taken into account for the future. So as a close, we hope that in future, the other countries can be joined with us in the next phase of land monitoring initiative. And also we hope that in the next phase, the other group in Bangladesh, Cambodia, India, Indonesia, Nepal, and Philippines can be joined in the focal point of this group. Later on, Tony Quizon from NGOC on behalf of the group will share the initial finding and observations from the conflict monitoring report, and hopefully we will receive constructive input and recommendations for our invited reactor from ILC, Allied, and UNDP. So thank you for joining our sessions. Thank you to NGOC for this initiative, and let the initiative come back to Mr. Don Marquez. Thank you.
Thank you, Dewi, for setting the stage, providing the context and the overview of the land conflict initiative. I think you highlighted that conflicts have increased, particularly in Indonesia during this time of pandemic, highlighting that injustice continue, and also the invitation to other groups and other countries to join us in this effort as we combat land conflicts. So to give us an opening remarks from the International Land Coalition, I now call on Mirgul Amanalevia, the coordinator of the Regional Coordination Unit, to give her remarks.
Thank you, dear Don, and good afternoon, dear friends and participants. I'm really happy to greet you once more on this session, and thank you for your time and for this opportunity too. Also, I would like to congratulate Landwatch Asia Group and NGOC with the great job that we are doing jointly as ILC members. So most of you know that protecting land for people who live on and from the land is one of the ILC priority, and it is clearly also articulated, reflected in our upcoming new ILC strategy for the next 9 years. For ILC Asia over the last 6 years, this priority has been reflected in supporting the members-led initiative to monitor land conflicts in the region and provide some emergency fund for those land and environmental rights defenders who are criminalized due to their activism in defending their land and territory. ILC has observed some, through the work of its members, of our members, that there are some similarities of root problems that are responsible for land-related conflicts, such as corporate land, led land, and the economic investment, conflicting legal framework, for example. And these problems are accepted by civic space in either narrowing or clothing in many countries in our region, you know. And despite the difficulties and the persistent challenges of land-related conflicts, I also strongly believe that concerned approach is needed to address them, ranging from monitor land conflicts, collecting the data and documenting this robust data for evidence advocacy to dialogue with others, all concerned actors, main key players. Asia Land Forum, I think it is the one of the important space for ILC members and a unique opportunity for all of us, for indigenous people, pastoralists, women and youth, all ILC partners, government officials as well, and other key actors to exchange ideas and information, learn new things from each other and new insights and propose common solutions. So ILC, as ILC Asia and in general as ILC, we really believe that data for monitoring, evidence-based learning and conflict resolution is also key. And also it is interesting in our new upcoming strategy how the grassroots-driven data can be endorsed by other wider world and it can be used for the resolve and mitigation of these land-related conflicts. So we are here to just to reconfirm our commitment to work with all of you on the conflict management and conflict resolution in the next strategy as well. So thank you for your attention, and I would like to wish good luck to Angok and for this session, and to the whole entire Landwatch Asia group.
Thank you, Mirgul. For the, I think you have highlighted that addressing land conflicts and defending the land rights defenders is a priority and will continue as a central theme in the next strategy of ILC, and that this kind of initiative contributes to the evidence-based advocacy, which ILC also will be doing in the next strategy. So without further ado now, let's continue, and I shall call on Denise Musni of Angok to present the framework and the overview of the methodology that the working group have utilized in 2020 in coming up with the land conflict monitoring reports.
Thank you, Don, and please help me with sharing the screen for my presentation. And good day to everyone. Good afternoon to most of you. To those who have attended the session earlier, I hope you are not yet sick of seeing my face and hearing my voice, but welcome to this afternoon session. I will be presenting the background, framework, and methodology of the 2020 Land Conflict Monitoring Initiative to set the scene, provide you with context, and also to temper your expectations for the presentation of the findings later. So next slide, please. Please, next slide. Land conflicts over time have increased and have been increasing actually in number, coverage, and intensity. And this we know to be true. This is not only happening in Asia, but around the world as well. And these have continued to threaten the livelihoods and lives of communities and rights defenders. Next, Don. Many social conflicts are rooted in issues related to land and resource rights. There are also a lot of long-enduring conflicts in Asia that have turned very violent, that at the core of those are scuffles or are conflicts related to who should be owning or managing land within this territory. And it's not just land, it's also the resources, common resources such as forests and also waters. Land conflicts and conflicts on resources may be traced to enduring historical injustices, inequitable access to land and resources, faulty and weak implementation of reforms, clashes between tenure system, misappropriation of state domains, and a general lack of regard for human rights of the disadvantaged. Next. So why do we monitor conflicts? Well, in general, if a conflict is present in an area, it's a clear indication that something is wrong. So conflicts provide a very observable indicator of unjust access to, control, or ownership of resources. And land conflicts are also dangerous and need immediate attention because in many of these cases, there are incidences of violence and violations of human rights. Finally, because of the nature of land conflicts, these signal an urgency for government and other stakeholders to immediately act. Next. Now, our working group member, KPA from Indonesia, has been constantly monitoring land conflicts and attacks against defenders since 2003. And they have been using their monitoring initiative to lobby for a genuine agrarian reform in Indonesia. Other working group members also produced conflict monitoring reports in 2018, but in 2018, slowing down. In 2018, we used our own methodologies. We allowed each country to conduct the studies using methodologies that they are most familiar and most comfortable with. And while the reports in 2018 were very useful and effective in painting an overall picture of how conflicts are within the countries, the varied scopes, definitions, and methodologies proved to limit the regional consolidation and the comparison and analysis of data. Next. Which brings us to the 2020 Land and Resource Conflict Monitoring Initiative. Now, most of the objectives for the conflict monitoring initiatives were the same in 2018 and in 2020. The key difference really is that in 2020, we tried to implement a common yet flexible system for collecting data and information on land conflicts. Other objectives include to describe the prevalence and types of conflicts, examine its nature and causes, discuss the impacts and outcomes, and to draw up recommendations based on the findings. Next. The overall process may be seen below. It looks very simple here, but as we know, and as is always the case, it was not a straightforward process. Of course, we started with planning meetings and meetings with KPA and Anggok, meetings among the working group members. We agreed on the tools that will be used, on our objectives, on the activities that will be conducted. And we also had bilateral mentoring. And the bilateral mentoring between Anggok and the other members of the working group continued until the rest of 2020. So the planning stage was around February to March. And then March to December, we conducted most of the data gathering and consultations. And data gathering really means monitoring of media reports, news reports, both online or on print materials. We processed and received case reports from CSOs and partner communities. Field visits and validation visits were also conducted. And again, bilateral consultations between the countries and Anggok, and consultations with CSOs and communities to kind of ask for a bit of help with the analysis of the findings that we have so far, and to gather recommendations from the data that emerges from the monitoring initiative. So this proved to be a challenge, as you may imagine, because we conducted all of this during the height of the coronavirus pandemic, which is still raging as of the moment. So everything, a lot of the activities were moved online, and even mentoring online was very difficult. It's hard, of course, to come together in terms of technical aspects when you're just talking through a screen and sharing your screen and asking the person on the other side to implement the changes you are also doing on your Excel sheet, things like that. And then from January to July of 2021, we started the report production and the validation process. So we started writing the country reports and also consulted continually with CSOs, communities, and in some cases with the human rights institutions and governments to present to them the reports, get their feedback if they have additional points for analysis or recommendations. And we are at this last stage now, which is the regional consolidation. So the regional summary is presently being put together. And we are having this regional conference now, although we plan for having additional follow-up work within the year and until 2021. So this is just the focal organizations for the 2020 land conflict monitoring. Involved again are 6 countries, and we have the following focal organizations: CDA, Star Kampuchea, CLRA, KPA, CSRC, and ANGOC for the Philippines, and the regional consolidation. And there are key commonalities in methods that we would like to highlight. As I mentioned earlier, while we implemented a common system, it was not uniform. So there were some flexibilities, but there are commonalities in these 7 aspects. So starting with number 1, next please. On the definition. So the working group agreed on key definitions. A glossary was prepared, and we utilized existing sources, international declarations, or existing studies from the working group. And one important thing that we defined was land conflict. So in 2018, we did not come into a good understanding of what land conflicts should cover, but at least in 2020, we came to this agreement that land conflicts should mean this one: a situation wherein 2 or more stakeholders compete for control over land and or resources. So that is key. We're not just restricted to land itself, including decision making and truth. Also, we cover what we call structural conflicts. So structural conflicts emanate from loopholes and contradictions in law, difference in paradigms or of competing tenure systems, or weak enforcement of legal and customary tenure systems. Then there are also these other definitions which we will touch on later, but I won't be going over now to save up on time. Next. Also, the scope. So we agreed that the following can be covered by the monitoring. So of course, we cover the land conflict cases themselves, basic information about the conflict, and this includes information on the type of land or resource that is being contested, the size, the location, the communities affected, how many people are affected, etc. We also covered what we call the relationships or the stakeholders involved. So these are typically your affected communities and the aggressors in the land conflict and their actions within the context of the conflict. And we covered incidents which include violence, attacks against human rights of communities and individuals, the victims and perpetrators, and their effects. Other information that were covered by the monitoring, we focused primarily on cases with reported incidents because anyway, that is how conflicts are usually reported. We hear of conflicts because we hear that people are being displaced or that there is criminalization against leaders of a community. So that cases with reported incidents comprise the bulk of the reports. And an example would be a contested mining application that led to the criminalization of an indigenous leader. But we also cover cases without incidents. So this is what we call latent conflicts. For example, there is ongoing opposition from fisherfolk communities on a planned reclamation activity, but there is no violence against the fisherfolk community within 2020. So the conflict is there, but thankfully there is no violence. And then finally, we also cover incidents not tied to a specific case. And this is especially prominent when you talk of activists who are working with a lot of different communities. So an example would be the slaying of an activist working with a peasants organization. Next. For the coverage, we were restricted to 1 calendar year. So structural conflicts that were ongoing in 2020, if they were resolved within 2020, but they were still active sometime within 2020, they were still covered by the monitoring. We also cover incidents that occurred within the time frame. And conflicts and incidents in rural areas were the priority, although in the Philippines, we also covered some peri-urban and urban areas. Next. Now, data sources, we use mostly secondary data from publicly available sources and other NGOs. And there were also some primary data used from community reports and field visits. And on the right, you will see a pie chart depicting the distribution of the types of sources used by the 6 countries in this monitoring initiative. Next. Yes, but there are key differences in scope and sources. As you may see, there is a vast difference in the number of cases covered, from a low of 19 to a high of 241 in Indonesia. And this is largely a result of the approach towards collecting data. You will see here the main sources of data and approaches to data gathering. So for example, in Bangladesh, they collected available information from mainstream media reports, mostly secondary data. In Cambodia, apart from media reports, they also were able to go to partner communities and used at least 94 sources. So I say at least because we count sources by type. So for example, so it's not one-to-one. So for example, in one case, for example, you have 3 online newspaper reports and 3 NGO reports as your sources. So that means you had 2 sources, mainstream media and NGO. And then in India, India is quite a special case because they already have the Land Conflict Watch, which has been continuing to monitor conflicts all over India. So it's national in scope, and 36 cases were handpicked from the database and were qualitatively analyzed in the reports. Then in Indonesia, of course, they conducted the regular monitoring using their own methods. In Nepal, they gathered conflict cases from partner communities, so it's mostly primary data from the District Land Rights Forum. And in the Philippines, we sought and collected reports from publicly accessible online sources, so mostly secondary, and used at least 388 sources. Now, there was also some form of data validation involved. For secondary data, we encouraged everyone to seek out at least 2 independent sources. Some were also able to conduct on-ground validation. But for reports that come from communities or CSOs, we consider those as already validated at the community level. However, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, validation was also a bit difficult. Therefore, there were some instances wherein there is only one source, but because the case is crucial or important, we decided to include them in the database. And for primary data, on-ground validation was conducted and following incident reports. So a good example of this is KPA. That's how they usually get their data. They get their data from reports from the communities, and they send the team to follow up to investigate further. Next. Perspective. Now there is quite of a bias because the perspectives and narratives for communities and rights holders are prioritized and given more weight. And this is in recognition of the fact that the experiences and narratives of communities are often overlooked because sometimes they are in a position of less power. So this perspective becomes really important, for example, in recording who the instigators of conflict are, who the perpetrators of violence are. And there are also many instances wherein the government or the military will say that a person is a communist or a rebel, but the community says otherwise. The community will say, no, he or she is just helping our community. He or she is an activist. And of course, we will take the side of the community in that case. Next. Okay, and the common Excel template was used by 4 countries to record data. This database was initiated and refined by working group members considering KPA's experiences since 2003 and considering also the results of the 2018 monitoring initiative. So the database has 3 parts. It captures the cases, information on the cases, the sectors or institutions involved, that green part over there, and incidents of violence or attacks. Next. And also, we agreed on common indicators and analysis. We followed a common outline for producing the country reports and had common indicators included in these reports. For example, all countries have the size of areas affected by conflicts, typology. We tried to make this as uniform as possible. We tried to disaggregate the victims of violence by sex, And some countries also followed common summary table templates. And an example of that is in the slide here, which will be discussed further in the later presentation. Therefore, with all of these commonalities, some level of aggregation of data across countries has been made possible. So we were able to consolidate at the regional level and also disaggregate per country. Next. Some differences, as I mentioned earlier, KPA continued to use their own format for continuity. But since the monitoring of other countries took inspiration from KPA, key data are still aggregable at the regional level. And also mentioned earlier, our partner in Indonesia analyzed select cases from Land Conflict Watch so as not to duplicate the work of the network, which has been continually monitoring conflicts in all Indian states. So Land Conflict Watch is a network of journalists working across India. Now, some reflections, and we discussed this with the working group. We are aware that, of course, the exercise is not perfect. As was mentioned by Ms. Dewi earlier, this is the first time that we tried to implement a common system for monitoring conflicts in Asia. And therefore, there are some inherent limitations. First and foremost, we recognize that not all land and resource conflicts are reported or documented. So there are data gaps in the way that media reports. There are gaps in the way that perhaps we gather data. We cannot monitor all of the social media networks, all of the dailies, all of the newspapers. We just do not have enough manpower to do so. Therefore, the conflicts that are presented here are what we can consider the bare minimum. There are for sure a lot more conflicts in other parts of Asia. And also, understanding of land conflict concepts may vary depending on context. Now, an example of this is in the beginning, we discussed what we called cultural violence. But as we were progressing with the monitoring, we realized that the understanding of cultural violence may vary and is not uniform across all countries. Then there is also the disparity in the number of conflicts and incidents reported, as was presented earlier. There are some with only less than 20 cases and some with over 200 cases. And we know that this may skew the regional summary. That's why I want you to keep in mind when listening to the regional summary later that contextualization is still key and is a must when analyzing databases, consolidated databases. And finally, the methods were common, but not uniform. So we now enter into a question of how much flexibility should we allow for the methods to be sound, but to also allow countries to be comfortable with the ways that they do things without stretching them or spreading them out too thinly. Next. And finally, we recognize also that we have a lot of areas for improvement. First is, of course, in the uniform understanding of concepts. Second would be in maximizing and expanding in-country networks for monitoring. So this has been a challenge in the pandemic. We realized that we have to really rely on partners on the ground, and we start to reflect on how we can further maximize our reach, knowing that we are constricted and limited in front of a screen for most of the time. And then we also discussed the further simplification of concepts and tools. In the beginning, we were quite ambitious and we wanted to have a comprehensive picture of land conflicts. Thus, you saw earlier the very long database with 3 parts. But then we later realized that it's really difficult to present and to consolidate this and to make this accessible to a wide audience if it's that complicated. And also, it becomes a problem for the people who are working on the research themselves if the concepts are too complicated. And thus, this brings us to enhancing the need to further enhance the research capacities of CSOs, especially in terms of analyzing quantitative data. We have a lot of technology through Excel. We can do a lot of statistical analysis, but we have not yet explored the full extent of what we can do with the numbers that we have. And finally, and I have been repeating this over and over again since the pandemic started, digital security. With everything moving online and with information on the conflicts also stored and shared online, how are we sure that our data is safe? And more importantly, how will we make sure that the communities whose stories are reflected in those databases are safe? What if it falls into the wrong hands? What if something bad happens? What if it leaks? We have to address questions like that. And I think that's the end of my presentation. Yeah, so thank you, everyone. And yes, thank you.
Thank you, Denise. It's a tough job to present the experience of the working group for the last 1.5 years. But we'll have some time, hopefully, in the plenary discussion on their questions on methodology. But to complete the story, I'll now call on Tony Kison to present the emerging trends, the findings, and the emerging and the recommendations that are emerging from the studies. So, Tony.
Can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Though it's not full screen.
Okay. This is the regional summary of land conflicts monitoring for 2020. I think the process was very well explained by Denise. And while we try to do an aggregation of the data and the analysis, I think there are three important points to point out. The first is that it is important to look into the country and the local contexts in which the land conflicts occur, the policies, the historical aspects, and other things that are uniquely, and even the cultural differences, the things that are unique to the countries. Second, because the studies are based on the monitoring mainly of by media and civil society organizations. In fact, they cover about 70% of the sources. They can only show a partial picture of the real situation. But however, we can begin to see certain trends and certain analysis. I think one of the important things here also is that we differentiate between what you call manifest and dormant conflict. Manifest means that it is simply because it is reported in media or something happened to the case, the conflict has probably been escalated at some level. So that is the difference between manifest, but also you also have dormant cases that have been there for a long time, but maybe nothing happened in 2020, and so they're not included in the reporting. And so this kind of summary actually is a is is a representation of the year 2020 of the manifest events of conflict. Thirdly, I think in a presentation that's full of statistics, I think it's easy to forget that there are real stories and real suffering behind the cases. I think we should not forget that part of the picture. I cannot forward there. This is the presentation outline. Let me just go directly into it. As was mentioned earlier, land conflicts are a key indicator of land governance and land rights. This is an overview of the land conflict cases. These are some very, very quick pictures of the 6 countries. You have 1,372 land conflict cases in 6 countries, 6.47 million hectares affected by ongoing conflicts, 2.37 million households affected by ongoing conflicts. If each household is about 5 people, that's over 12 million, maybe 13, almost like 13 million people, between 5 and 6 people per household. So you can immediately see the extent of land conflicts. We also asked them to look into the duration of conflicts. So you can see that a lot of the conflicts have been going on for many years. The range is between 1 to 99 years. But as we also understand, conflicts can happen in layers. It means that an indigenous, a land under conflict owned by the indigenous peoples, that conflict might have been going on for hundreds of years. But suddenly a plantation owner purchases that land and purchases that land, let's say, 10 years ago. The media will report it as a conflict that started 10 years ago, but it's actually, you're actually looking at the layer, at only a layer of conflict. So this is what the media is reporting, but it is significant. Most of the ongoing land conflicts reportedly started between 2005 to 2014. If we look back, the years 2005 to 2014 were also the years when land acquisitions were highest, and we had the food crisis sometime in 2008. So it might fit. We don't know whether that is the story, but it somehow fits the frequency in terms of the start of the land conflicts. So this is the breakdown per country of the conflict cases, the area affected in terms of hectares, and the households affected. About 57% of all these figures come from one country, from India, and the data is from the Land Conflict Watch portal, which was accessed on September 8, 2021. So it's not really 2020, but in 2021. The total area of land conflict in the 6 countries is nearly the size of Sri Lanka. It's 6.5 million hectares. In the Philippines, the area affected is 1.6 million hectares. That is over 5% of the entire land area of the Philippines. If we assess the types of land affected by conflict based on the number of cases in 4 countries, this covers 4 countries. The types of land, the most affected were smallholder agriculture, housing, and then ancestral domains. And then also you have water and fishery resources, as reported in the Philippines and in Cambodia. This is the breakdown in terms of the types of land affected by conflict. The most frequent type of land conflict affected land is our agricultural lands, mainly used for smallholder farming, housing or residential lands, whether in rural and also urban areas, covered 26% of the cases. in many of the cases, you have more than one land use involved. But this is the dominant types of land in 435 cases in the four countries. So you can see that communal lands, this is mainly for indigenous peoples, but also you have ancestral domains um, in the Philippines, 65, 14.9, and plus 3.2. That would probably cover the indigenous people's lands based on the number of cases. Stakeholders in conflict, the black one represents the affected communities in terms, again, this is based on the number of cases in four countries, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Nepal, and the Philippines. And on the right side, these are the adversarial claimants, what some reports might also call the instigators of conflict. So in terms of the affected communities, the most affected are farmers, 234 communities, indigenous peoples, 106. And then you have fisher folk, residents, forest users, slum dwellers, and others. In terms of the adversarial claimants, 237 of the cases were had the private companies as the adversaries. Next was government, usually government projects. Then you had powerful individuals. These are the powerful and influential individuals. Usually these are either ex-bureaucrats or ex-military, not in the active service. But you also have the military itself in 23 cases, state-owned enterprises, and then other claimants, and then others. So this shows a picture of the stakeholders in conflict. This is the breakdown of the types of sectors or communities affected. You can see here that small farmers comprise 55.8% of in terms of the number of communities in the four countries. And indigenous peoples comprise 25% of the communities affected. The figure for indigenous communities is very significant, considering that, for example, in terms of population, in the Philippines, for example, the population of indigenous peoples is estimated at between 12 to 15%. In Nepal, the estimate is about 36%. In Cambodia and Bangladesh, they're estimated to be less than 2% of the population. So in these countries, having 25% of the cases affected by land conflict is really significant. So 3/4 of all those affected are either indigenous peoples or farmers. You also have fisher folk, slum dwellers, other residents, and forest users. The main adversaries in land conflict, 56% in terms of the total number, 200 of the 423 total cases, 237 or 56% were because of the entry of private companies, sometimes with the support of government. 16% were due to government itself. Some of these involve infrastructure and development projects. You have powerful individuals who exert influence either politically or economically. Then you have 5.4%, which is by active military personnel or by the military itself. And then you have state-owned enterprises. Other claimants, these represent, usually these are other communities, like conflicts between indigenous peoples and farmers and farmer groups. This is what you call the other claimants. Then you have the other kinds of adversaries, institutions such as schools, rebels, illegal loggers, foreign vessels, and others that are unspecified. What are the drivers of conflict? We tried to compare and consolidate data across the different countries. So this covers all the 6 countries. The number of cases this covers is 1,372 cases. So you can see that private investments and government projects together comprise about about 75% of the sources of conflict or the drivers of conflict. Conflicts over shared resources represents conflict over public lands. Overlapping claims is conflict between 2 communities. Resistance to land reform is usually agrarian related, and resistance by landlords to reform efforts of government. Public-private partnership is also a subset of the private and government projects. It's a joint venture. So this is a summary of the drivers of conflict by type or source. This is a breakdown of the drivers of conflict by the different countries. So you can see the different nature of conflict in the different countries. Sorry, this is Cambodia. This is Cambodia. So you can see in Cambodia, for example, the dominant driver of conflict are private investments, mainly also involving ELCs or economic land concessions given by government. In India, you can see a very large portion that's due to government projects. Indonesia, with the expansion of plantations, mining, and extractive industries, a lot of it also is due to private investments. But the government projects and resource conflicts are also significant. In the Philippines, it's private investments. And in Nepal, it's government projects. Many of the conflicts also, aside from the private investments and government projects, you can see also a growing trend in terms of conflicts over common resources, such as over forests and protected areas. 23%. And this is during the time of the pandemic. Like IPs being restricted, for example, from accessing resources within national parks, 23%. We go next into looking into individual and community victims of human rights violations. Let me just go directly to it in the interest of time. In terms of by gender, it is quite difficult because a large number is unspecified from the reports of in terms of the victims, individual victims of human rights violations. So you have male 406, female 96, and unspecified 206. It is also noted that the impact of land conflicts on women are not easily visible and also go unreported in media reports. For example, in 2008, a CCHR study in Cambodia, which interviewed over 500 women, or half of the women interviewed said land affected their family relations, and 23% experienced domestic abuse. And you can see here, again, the breakdown. Below, you can see the breakdown of the victims of human rights violations by gender and by country in 5 of the countries. In terms of individual violence, here are some of the key figures. 50 people were killed within 1 year. 78 were injured. 214 were threatened with death, injury, detention, and displacement. And 196 were criminalized. What do you mean by criminalized? This is a case, especially in Indonesia, where community leaders or oppositors or affected community leaders are charged with common crimes, not with resisting arrest or things like that, but with common crimes like theft, like trespassing, and others. And we also see this as a way by which leaders are being criminalized or being um, associated with crime or discredited in front of communities. So this is the breakdown of physical violence per country. So injury and assault mainly in Bangladesh, but you have 1 rape case here and 1 torture case in Bangladesh. In Cambodia, you have 19 cases of eviction, 15 cases of detainment, and 9 cases of assault. In Indonesia, you have 19 cases of assault and 11 killings. Cambodia, 1 killing. Indonesia, you have 11 killings. In Nepal, you have 62 cases of individual eviction and 1 case of injury and assault. In the Philippines, you have 38 killings, 49 detentions, 10 injuries, and 40 cases of disappearance, abduction, and arrest, and 1 case of torture. So you can see also that most of the killings happened in the Philippines. There are other forms of violence. First is the threat of death, injury, detention, displacement. 204 cases against individuals, and usually these are the local organizers or the local leaders. Destruction of property, 184 cases. Criminalization, 196 cases from the 5 countries. In terms of the perpetrators of individual violence, 58% are armed agents of the state, either the police or the military. 28% are by powerful individuals or by people in authority. Private companies and private armed groups are responsible or seen as responsible for 8% of the cases. The others are unidentified. This is the breakdown of the perpetrators of individual violence according to country, looking into the four countries that used a similar approach and recorded similar information. So you can see in Cambodia, it's mainly the armed state agents and the powerful individuals. But you also have cases where private companies and their armed groups also cause individual violence. In Indonesia, it's mostly the state and by private companies. In Nepal, it's again the state agents, and individuals. In the Philippines, it's state agents, individuals, but you also have significant numbers that are in terms of private companies. These are the total count of the perpetrators. 717. Next, we look into the violence against communities. Sorry, this is earlier. Violence against communities. You have displaced households, people who are evicted from their homes and their lands. 29,507 displaced households. You also have, in addition, 22,247 households affected by forcible entry, whether it's by corporations, investments, projects. So here, this is the physical displacement of households. Here, in this case, with the 22,000 with the forcible entry, is that you may still be on your land, but there are other people and other interests already also in your land. This is a summary of the households affected by community violence by country, again, in the four countries. Of all the total affected households, the total affected households were 80,216 households. 36% affected by displacement, and 27.7% affected by forcible entry. But you also have a phenomenon of red tagging in the Philippines. What does red tagging mean? It means being accused of being rebels or communists. In a way, red tagging is also a form of threat on your own life when you are red tagged, because it also signals that the military can kill you. And then you have others. Again, I'd like to say that these are affected households, not individuals. So you multiply that by 5 or 6 people per household. Who are the perpetrators of community violence? The picture is is similar to individual violence. Armed state agents are responsible for 63%, powerful individuals by 12%, and private companies for 9.5%. So you can see that while a large proportion of the cases are because of the entry of private corporations on the land, the perpetrators of violence are state agents. You also have households affected by ecological violence. 55,882 had their um, environment and ecology affected, whether it's pollution of water or destruction of their forests and sources of livelihood. So 53% had contamination of resources and pollution, 25% suffered from deforestation, and 21% suffered from the depletion of productivity due to the actions of the usually land grabbers. Sorry, this is a duplication of this item here, 53%. This table only includes 3 countries where ecological violence was included in the monitoring. 1 out of 4 affected households suffered from destruction of biodiversity. I hear you this. Addressing land conflicts. In addressing land conflicts, there are several mechanisms, either through the courts, through government administrative action, through local mediation, through political action, and so forth. I didn't include that slide anymore here for brevity. But the question asked was there corrective action taken? From those with answers, many of the media reports and the monitoring, they're not able to answer the question of whether corrective action was taken within the year 2020. So out of the 360 cases, you have a large number, over 100, where you don't know whether the cases were solved or addressed. But from those numbers that we know, there was some corrective action taken by government in about 24% of the cases, by the company in 3% of the cases, and by third parties in 2% of the cases. But in 71% of the cases, no corrective action was taken. Again, I should mention here that in cases where there were corrective action, it is not clear whether communities are satisfied with the outcome of the conflict. Let me just try to summarize quickly and get into the recommendations in the interest of time. This is just a quick summary. There were at least 1,372 reported cases of land conflict in 6 countries in 2020, covering 6.47 million hectares and affecting 2.37 million households. Many of the land conflicts have been going on unresolved for many years, between 1 to 94 years. In actual numbers, and this is comparing for the Philippines and Indonesia, because only these 2 countries used the same methodology for 1998 and year 2000. In actual numbers, land conflict cases in 2020 slightly decreased compared to the pre-COVID period, but the decline amidst a pandemic and economic crisis remains insignificant. The decline is also partly due to one is data gaps due to pandemic restrictions on mobility, limitations on media reporting and civic space. Two, there is also an actual decrease in the number of reported community versus community land conflicts in the Philippines, and it is significant, from 127 cases to 19 cases. It doesn't mean that that these cases have been resolved, for example, between indigenous peoples and non-indigenous peoples living in ancestral domains, but that there were no incidents. The conflict did not escalate during a pandemic. We have a raging conflict amidst a health crisis with governments and private corporations at the center of the chaos. In the Philippines, although the number of cases decreased, the area under conflict actually increased from 1.28 million hectares in 2018 to 1.7 million hectares in 2020. In Indonesia, land conflicts increased in Indonesia's plantation sector by 28% and forestry sector by 100%. Within a health crisis, most of the land conflicts in 2020 were percent of the cases, followed by government 16% and powerful individuals 11.6%. In some cases, the pandemic itself provided the opportunity for corporations and governments to push forward controversial acquisitions and projects. In terms of the drivers, the key drivers or sources of land conflict in 2020 were private business investments, 35%, government projects, more or less 35%, and resource conflicts over common property with the increased incursion into forests and public lands. Underlying these drivers are more fundamental issues: historical injustices, inequitable distribution of land, conflict between legal and customary tenure domains, and the mismanagement of what you call state domains. By sector, the most number in terms of the affected communities were small farmers and producers and indigenous peoples. And this highlights again the need to address agrarian reform issues and indigenous peoples' rights. But if you look at into land area, the largest land areas in terms of hectareage affected by conflict were those of indigenous peoples and also forest areas, especially in the Philippines and India. In India, for example, the paper reported that 36% of the affected land were public lands, but commonly held lands. Ironically, in countries with progressive Philippines and India, many land conflicts have led to violence. In 5 countries, there were 708 victims of human rights violations. Physical violence was most visible: 50 killed, 78 injured, 81 evicted, 64 detained, 41 illegally detained or disappeared, 2 tortured, and 1 raped. 38 of the 50 killed were in the Philippines, which continues to rank as among the most dangerous countries for land rights defenders. Other forms of violence were also committed. In 4 countries, 80,000 households fell victim to violence against communities. In 3 countries, 55,000 households became victims of environmental destructions. However, again, I would say that many of the impacts of land conflicts are invisible and go unreported. The effects on household life, domestic abuse, schooling of children, and even employment. Most cases of violence against both individuals and communities were instigated by armed agents of the state. It should be noted also that state agents have been used to protect corporate interests on land, and the state itself is often seen to act as a broker for private investments. Also, in one of the studies, restrictions under the pandemic were also implemented by the military and the police, which restricted movement, including of civil society. In the four countries with 415 cases, families resorted to affected communities and families resorted to negotiation 20%, courts and legal action 18%, government administrative bodies 18%, and local customary systems 3%. A large number used political actions, protests, demonstrations, negotiation. I mean, not negotiation, uh, public, public, public events. While some so-called corrective action was taken by government in 24% of the cases and by companies in 3% of the cases, no actions were deemed taken in 71% of the cases. Also, we don't know whether how the cases were corrected or whether they were resolved or whether the communities are satisfied. Next, we go to the set of recommendations. There's a lot of recommendations here. I'll just highlight maybe a few in the interest of time. One is to immediately desist from all forms of arbitrary evictions and displacement, especially under the current crisis and even after the current crisis. Adhere to state commitments to human rights, ensure the integrity of safeguard mechanisms, promote good business by immediately applying the UNGPs in all state-run corporations and plantations, especially Indonesia. Independent commissions for investigation and resolution of land conflicts. Why do we say independent? Because in many of the cases, government or government agents are also involved. We also need to address the roots of the land conflict, which requires a fundamental shift in development thinking, the focus on smallholder farming and agrarian reforms, customary land rights, delineation and allocation of rights under the so-called public domain, reviewing the scope of public interest, especially in state-led land acquisitions, and questioning the role of state and officials as brokers for private land investments. We have some recommendations to business and private sector, but I think the key here is that the private sector has a responsibility and duty to respect human rights of people in all their operations. And there should be better disclosure, full disclosure of all master plans, EIAs, SIAs, and relevant info relating especially to concessions. Also, the disclosure of ownership and investors. To national human rights institutions to conduct field investigations, include land conflict monitoring in their reports, and to promote the UNGP BHR. To CSOs to directly assist communities under conflict, help them seek justice, improve monitoring and investigation work, improve reporting and response mechanisms, and share information through media, establish independent people's commissions to investigate, organize and empower local communities, provide legal education and train local paralegals, strengthen local mediation, monitor NHRIs and judicial bodies in terms of addressing conflicts and promoting nonviolent responses and actions. Maybe I'd just like to add that as we face a post-pandemic period, there are challenges that we face. One is the increased poverty and desperation among the rural poor, an increased concentration of power, increased inequalities, an emerging food crisis, which might be similar to 2008 to 2010 period when we experienced the highest level of land acquisitions in Asia as well as globally. And finally, the role of governments. Many of the governments are now bankrupt and they are now increasingly acting as broker for land-based investments. So this could probably drive up even more the level of land conflicts that we experience today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you for viewing the 6 country reports. On the surface, it looked simple and easy, but the processes that have been undertaken from the data gathering to the consolidation to the analysis is a long process. So I've seen there's a number of exchanges in the chat box. We will have time for that during the plenary. But let me invite first 3 reactors to the presentations. First, I call on Eva Hershaw from the International Land Coalition. Again, thank you for staying early to provide a brief remark on the methodology used by the Landwatch Asia Working Group on Land Rights as Human Rights in this land conflict monitoring initiative, and how it can or may contribute to the Landex and the SDG monitoring processes. Eva?
Yes, thank you, Don and Denise and Tony. You'll tell me if you don't hear me well, but it's really great to be here with you and to see a lot of members and to really see the fruits of this huge effort that Landwatch Asia has made over the last year. I know this has been an ongoing process, but really the advancements made over the last year are impressive. And I really think that the results that you've shown here speak for themselves. So congratulations to all of you and for this baseline, this first step that you've made. I really think that this is a case where efforts being made locally, regionally by partners in country are really informing our thinking, our ways of processing our own work that's aiming to support them and to upscale some of the methods and processes that they've established. So I'll be speaking today quickly from my role at the International Land Coalition. I work at the Secretariat on Data and Land Monitoring, specifically with Landex, and then also as a member, as a co-lead of the Allied Data Working Group, which Don mentioned and that my colleague Anna will speak about in a little more detail. We've been undergoing over the last 2 years a similar process at the global level, trying to integrate various data sets across a number of countries on violence against land and environment and indigenous defenders. And I think that the work that we're trying to do is so well reflected and in a very concrete way by the results presented by Landwatch Asia. We see clearly the complexity of land conflict. Tony presented the conflicts, the data that was collected by this group in a number of different ways that allow us to visualize not only the land that is contested, but the communities that are at risk, and then individuals who suffer in the most acute incidences of violence as a result. So we also see that across, even on a regional level, that the complexity also applies to the kinds of criminalization that can apply in a specific country. What characterizes those conflicts or the violations, as well as the terms that are used, the kind of threats that are most common, that those are very specific to national context. Yet another thing that came through strongly for me was what we gain by working together. So not overlooking this complexity, but to look at different data sources across different countries and see what they're telling us together, and see how these data sources considered in a common way can actually better depict the scale of violence, the ongoing, the area covered by such violence, and that we can, to some extent across these countries, speak in common terms, that there are common denominators across these attacks, and looking at them together gives us a better sense of the fact that this violence passes national borders, right? That they're regional and global trends. Something that came through for me very, very clearly and strongly in the presentation from Denise, this common but not uniform, right? There's a need for standardization if we can look across data sets and see that there are specific categories, there is some vital information, right? The who, what, when, by whom, what were these defenders defending, who do we expect the perpetrator was? That these are things that we can look at together in a standardized way, and that arriving to that common number with all of its caveats has a great deal of power. That at the same time, that this need for flexibility is built into these processes. So if you standardize data collection around violence to the point that you're no longer able to compare anything, we've lost the advantage that we gain by working together. Right? So this need for specific narratives, for context, the reports that were written for each country broaden our understanding of what those numbers can tell us about these patterns regionally. I want to quickly discuss where the process we've gone through as the data working group. As part of the Alliance, as I said, for Land, Indigenous and Environmental Defenders. ANGOC has contributed, building on the Landwatch Asia methodology, has contributed directly to our thinking around this. What we're trying to do on a global level very much imitates what Landwatch Asia has succeeded in doing on a regional level. And this is within the broader context of Landex, so Landex being a global land monitoring initiative, violence against land and environmental defenders being one indication, as the speakers today mentioned, that something's not working, that land governance is failing to protect those who are defending their land, territories, and resources beyond it. So what we did, and it very much looks like the Landwatch Asia process, we are working in 5 pilot countries, the Philippines being one of them, but also Kenya, Colombia, Mexico, and Guatemala. And what we did was go into these countries, always with local partners, and identify data sets that existed. These could be, as we said before, from various sources, but identifying information and data about the violence against land and environmental defenders, which was often a subset of a broader data set of violence against human rights defenders. Then we had consultations with the people that were putting together those data sets. We had to profile how often was this data collected? What kind of data was it? What kind of information were we working with? Were these narrative reports? Was there an Excel sheet that we could access? What information was contained there? And then we as a group decided what were the subsets of information, what kind of attacks were we going to look at together? So if if I can share my screen quickly, I'll show you how we're putting this into Landex. And for those of you who work on Landex, you'll know that we have a number of indicators that are divided according to commitment. If you go to the batch upload here of protection against land rights defenders, you will have the option of downloading and then working with a template very similar to the one that Landwatch Asia is using. As the speakers today highlighted, there's a need to look not only at defenders and individual attacks, but also at events, and then consider how we can categorize these defenders, providing a broad scope of options that will allow us to compare while capturing the nuances of these different countries. And finally, that this data set, that the data working group will be able to download. So what we're trying to do is integrate data sets not only across countries, as Landwatch Asia has done, but also at various levels. So here you imagine the effort that Landwatch Asia has done, adding to that global data sets that we're aware of, the Global Witness frontline defenders, trying to see how we can scale up this, again, view that we can get when we combine data sets across regions and align verification methods and use. So I just want to end, and I'm afraid I already went over, but with a few questions and reflections from the report. Of course, we won't be able to answer all of these, but we know, and it's clear also in the data collected from Landwatch Asia, that lethal attacks, killings are often, they are the easiest to verify. It's the easiest data to collect. We also know that these attacks are commonly preceded by non-lethal attacks, by threats. How do we capture this data, which is much more difficult to verify? And is there a need to be more flexible with requirements, recognizing the value that this data provides? We also know, and Anna will speak in more detail to this, that the United Nations, the data that they're reporting on violence against defenders is by and large depending on cases reported by civil society. Civil society, the efforts you're making have become the de facto official data on violence against defenders. So how do we use this to push governments to do a better job, to monitor these trends and the situation of land defenders? Can we work with national human rights institutes? Are they allies in this process? And in the countries where you were collecting data, could they serve as amplifiers of these messages? Then finally, is the SDG framework able to provide a useful platform to push governments? We know that only 14 countries since 2015 have reported any violence to the United Nations against land and environmental defenders. We know that's far from reality. How can we use this reporting framework to encourage better monitoring by the state? I'll stop here and let Anna continue, but thanks again so much for your work and for sharing.
Thanks, Eva. Now I call on Anna Subona. She is from the Alliance for Land, Indigenous and Environmental Defenders, and she will provide a brief remark on the recommendations of the studies that were presented and how Allied will be able to partner in pushing these recommendations at the global level. Anna?
Thank you so much, Don. I will also share my screen if that's okay. Let me try and do that. Just a second. Apologies. Okay, hope you can see it.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So as Don was saying, and as Eva was saying, we work quite closely together through the Allied Coalition that I am representing today. So my name is Anna Subona. I work with the Business and Human Rights Resource Center based in London, and I've had the privilege of meeting some of you a few years ago when we were still able to travel. And what I came here to share is, first of all, just huge admiration for the work that's been done by this group, and the lessons that we can all learn from this approach, as Eva was saying, and that we have been learning, and also to tell you a little bit about how the Alliance has come together, how we work, and how we may be able to build on the important work done here. So Allied Coalition has come together about 3 years ago. It now unites over 60 national, regional, and international organizations that are working to address root causes of threats and attacks on land and environmental defenders, and to overcome some of the silos that we all know exist, especially between environmental and human rights organizations, but also between local, regional, and global levels of work. So we won't be able to go through all of this, but here I've listed all the different goals that Allied set for itself in its first phase of work. As Eva mentioned, the pilot countries that we focused on were Kenya, Philippines, Colombia, Mexico, and then Guatemala. The two I'll go into a little bit that are most relevant here are the data working group, which aims to collect data on criminalization threats and attacks on defenders beyond just the data on killings, as Eva said, and also the law and advocacy working group, which works to, among other things, challenge business to integrate stronger protections for defenders into policies and practices, but also work with governments in various ways. So the Allied Data Working Group that NGOC is a member of, and that ILC and my organization are co-conveners of, is a group of over 20 national and global data collectors of attacks on defenders. We've come together to reduce fragmentation of data and to collect a global consolidated data set that Eva already mentioned. And I just want to highlight how important the lessons learned from this group have been to the data working group, and NGOC has done a really powerful job of bringing them to our group, and also really pushing us as a whole to think of, why are we doing this? How are we going to use this global data set, and what we won't do with it? So that was part of the reason why we set ourselves these 4 kind of use cases, which are to help the creation of stronger protection protocols. And we hope that our data will lead to creation of stronger protection protocols in different countries, lead to more support of civil society actors who are addressing root causes, to create demands on governments to better protect defenders, but also to create better data on attacks, better official data, and I'll go into that a bit, to require business to put in place appropriate safeguards for defenders, collectives, and communities, and also to then support the advocacy targets of broader Allied. We have also set ourselves we have developed together these guiding principles that we work with. So long-term commitment, guidance by strengthening of and support of the national data collectors, inclusion, rigor, systemic change, solidarity, and data sovereignty. We have so far been able to develop our joint approaches, baseline agreements, and data sharing agreements, which are rooted in these principles. We have also seen that it's important to highlight, to not just aggregate our own data for all the use cases that we have mentioned, but also to shed light on the fact that governments are not doing what they should be doing in terms of official data collection. So as Eva had mentioned, we have created a crucial gap report, which analyzed what official data exists on this. And we have found that it's largely missing, that very few countries submit any data on this at all through their voluntary national reviews of sustainable development goals, and that OHCHR at the UN overwhelmingly depends on civil society. We won't again be able to go into all that has led us to recommend, but I want to highlight some of these recommendations because I think they're quite powerful for all of us to hopefully use together. And so these are the recommendations that we point out in the report. which basically aim to recognize that there's a huge effort done by civil society to collect this data, and that basically there needs to be a lot more done by governments, and to disaggregate this data appropriately so that vulnerable groups, including land indigenous rights and environmental defenders, are visible. Finally, and I know I'm over time, I want to mention that Allied Law and Advocacy Working Group is also going to be hugely benefiting from the work you've all done. The Law and Advocacy Working Group aims to, as we said, push the business sector, investors, companies to have better policies and approaches to addressing, identifying conflicts and attacks on land and environmental defenders. That's not the only thing the working group does. As I said, it does also work quite a lot with governments. Maybe two things to highlight is we've done quite a bit of work recently to influence what mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence laws at the EU level, which we see as probably the biggest breakthrough in the business and human rights space in the past few years. We've been pushing through this group for them to include safeguards to defenders and to mandate meaningful and safe consultation engagement with groups. And we're also making the case that this should in no way undermine indigenous people's rights and FPIC rights. So this has been the focus. What I take from this presentation is that we really need to get these allies that we know we have on the international level, such as the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, the UNDP, the Special Rapporteur on Defenders, European Commission in some way, to hear your recommendations and to make sure that they hear even more granular recommendations than what we have been able to bring to them so far. I would just emphasize that I see opportunities on the level of the regional fora on business and human rights. I know UNDP and Asia section that's focusing on business and human rights is very interested in defenders. And I could see them possibly be very interested in findings of these reports. And maybe just to flag that there's also a potential revision of OECD guidelines on the horizon. And there should be a joint push to include defenders and these recommendations into these important guidelines that a lot of businesses look up to. Yeah, maybe I'll just finish with just saying how I really have learned a lot from your work personally, and how NGOC is such a valued member of the data working group and of Allied more broadly. I feel that the three kind of recommendations that really stuck with me, or your approaches, are you're talking about long-term conflicts and showing how there's this long-term ongoing conflict that sometimes or very often these incidents stem from, and I don't think that comes across enough on the global level. I also think it's really powerful how you separate between instigators and adversaries of conflict and perpetrators of conflict. And we all know that's important because companies hide behind military and the police, and state is acting as a broker, as was said. And I just don't think that aspect gets highlighted enough. So I think that's a really critical point to be driving forward together. And then I really also like the corrective action focus that you have, which we don't think capture enough yet, again, in the global databases. So thanks a lot for letting me comment today, and sorry that I went over time.
Thanks, Anna, and we look forward on how we can further push these recommendations in the global level. I now call on Livio Sarandrea, the team leader of the United Nations Development Program of the Business and Human Rights team in Asia, who has also been supporting this land conflict initiative, and perhaps share his views on how the recommendations can be elevated at the Asia level, in which particular institutions. Livio?
Thank you. Thank you, Don. It's always a pleasure to participate to these very important forums on land rights. I participate in many events on business and human rights. It's my area of work, and all too often business and human rights is seen almost exclusively as an issue that has to do with labor rights. It's striking, really. So I'm really happy to learn more about the issue of land rights and bring that into the conversation I'm part of in Asia and indeed globally. Let me add my voice also to really congratulate warmly for the report. Very rich, great methodology, lots of data. Indeed, the United Nations and all the other actors rely on this great work from civil society to have data around abuses that are taking place. So it's absolutely critical, the work you are doing. I do hope policymakers, governments, indeed companies read these data, which are striking, really striking, and can be of extreme use. They can be very useful for governments, for businesses, in ways which I'm briefly going to illustrate. When I come to some recommendations, they certainly are very useful to us. So, and of course, while I'm saying this, I'm pledging whatever support we can give you to make sure that this data is known. It doesn't remain within a circle of converted, so to speak. It's very important that happens. I certainly encourage all of you to disseminate this data, including during UPR processes, which I consider one of those stages where civil society and other actors, but even civil society directly, can open the eyes of many actors when showing data. Obviously, I'm very glad that there was a strong use of the private sector business, I should say, lens in the analysis of the reports, because that's what I mostly deal with, and this is what my remarks are gonna be focusing on. Again, not surprised to see so much data pointing to private sector, but perhaps surprised about the percentage of these adversarial claimants, as they were called. And again, seeing private sector or business sector, if we include state-owned enterprises, being by far the largest instigator of conflicts. It's really something that should open the eyes to those that have not realized yet the importance of private sector being a duty bearer, an additional duty bearer, right? We all know that the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights turn private sector, business sector into this additional duty bearer. And I really want to stress that, because this is not only an issue of compliance, it's actually an issue of responsibility. We really need to make sure that the private sector takes on board its role, as explained in the UN Guiding Principle, as a duty bearer vis-a-vis preventing these abuses, remediating the abuses when they do take place. Striking again, though not surprising, to see how often the state is a broker for this private investment, which per se it probably is not necessarily negative to be a broker, but be a broker of investments that abuse human rights is definitely something that goes against what we expect from companies, from states when it comes to Pillar 1 of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Very interesting also to see how the pandemic made the situation worse and provided more opportunities to corporations to actually push forward, perhaps with states as their allies, controversial acquisitions. So perhaps, you know, some quick sort of recommendations and other reflections that can add to the very good ones you presented at the end of your report, and perhaps divided them by pillar, if I may, for those who are familiar with the division of the UN Guiding Principles into role of state, role of companies, and remedy pillar. So obviously, when it comes to the state, which still have the primary protection and prevention role, I see these data as being very crucial for them to be aware of what's happening. Again, you're gathering precious data. Many countries in Asia are drafting national action plans on business and human rights. We know that the first step of drafting NAPs is an NBA, National Baseline Assessment. That data needs to be fed into these processes at the right time, right? I mean, in Thailand, we already know land rights is actually already a priority in the adopted NAP, but there are NAPs being adopted in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Mongolia, in India, and in Vietnam, indeed, Nepal, one recently adopted in Pakistan. So all those countries that are drafting NAPs, this information should be made available so that land rights features into the priorities for these plans. I've heard Indonesia being mentioned over and over and over and over. I'm not entirely sure land rights are a priority in the upcoming NAP of Indonesia. Of course, I'll take it upon ourselves to make sure that they are aware of this information, and I'm sure civil society, those based in Indonesia, will also do the same. The NAP in Indonesia was not published yet. There is still an opportunity to ensure the land rights is among the priority of the Indonesian NAP, and indeed the Malaysian NAP, Vietnam, and you name it, and all the others. Happy, of course, to connect with all of you to make sure that this information is fed into NBAs and eventually, of course, into NAPs. I think Eva mentioned the role for NHRIs. How can we use this data? How can this data be useful to make a difference? I really think, and in this sense, I connect to also points made by Anna, I think that the biggest opportunity we have to make sure that this data is translated into action is making the business case for it, or the legal case for it, if you like, the one connected to the upcoming mandatory norms on human rights and environmental due diligence, coming from the EU mostly, but impacting supply chains in Asia. So flagging to governments and to companies how all these violations will translate very, very soon, not only in reputational risks for companies and for trade, but in actual legal risks. It's one way to ensure that these same actors will give more attention to it. A role of companies, and I know time is running out. Role of companies. It's important to stress the recent focus of the UN Working Group on Human Rights on heightened human rights due diligence, meaning human rights due diligence during time or scenarios of conflict. I think it does apply to this particular circumstance. So heightened human rights due diligence that can be sort of simplified or summarized into the use of human rights due diligence alongside conflict sensitivity instruments. It's a relatively new sort of methodology that actually UNDP will be providing toolkits and guidance for. I really think you should probably point in terms of recommendations to companies the necessity to conduct heightened human rights due diligence. I don't think I've seen that in your recommendations. It's a recommendation I want to give you. And again, on that, we can perhaps remain connected, because we can help you in making sure on one side what that really means, and at the same time in your recommendations, provide those companies with the instruments to conduct a human rights due diligence, which is also uses the conflict sensitivity lens. Last but not least, remedies. Certainly NHRIs have a role and should have a role to play. A lot was said about human rights defenders. I'll perhaps mention also the importance of effective grievance mechanisms, judicial ones, state non-judicial, but also companies' grievance mechanism, difficult to operationalize, but should not be forgotten. So it's another perhaps recommendation can be included into companies using or creating, if they're not there yet, grievance mechanism that can also address land conflicts. I'll perhaps stop here to save some time for questions if some is left indeed. Over to you, Don.
Thank you, Livio. Again, a pleasure being a partner with UNDP BHR team in our fight towards promoting and defending the rights of communities to land. I now give the floor to Vivi Rawat from Social Development Foundation, a member also of this working group, to moderate the plenary discussion. I have noted that there were already questions and there were also answers in the chat box in terms of the report. So perhaps we can focus more on what we meaning ILC Asia can do together at the regional level to solve or to address this issue of land conflicts. So I call on Vivi to moderate the session. So I also ask the indulgence of the participants if we can just extend by 10 to 15 minutes so that we complete this event. So Vivi?
Yeah, thank you very much, Don. The entire session was extremely useful and the observation was very important. I hope our friends who will intervene or speak here will make some suggestions so that we can move forward. I would there are certain observations which are, from my understanding, was very, very important. But I also feel it is also time for us to think about the dilution of the laws which are enabling by the government to help the private sector a lot at the cost of the indigenous communities. So sometimes it is the legalization of the displacement, legalization of the uprooting of the communities. So one side we are fighting for the human rights, and the other side we are witnessing actually the dilution of the existing rules and regulations which have been protecting the indigenous communities and people's rights. So that analysis or monitoring of the laws is also very important, I feel, and this is my suggestion. So I would request friends, if they have any clarification on the presentation which have been made earlier by Denise and then by Tony, it will be good if we get some observation on them. Anything on the methodology and the outcome or the report? Because we heard three panelists. Now it is time for all the members and other people who are with us